December 7, 1944. High above the Japanese mainland, a lone B-29 superfortress cuts through the darkness like a silver ghost. Suddenly, the night sky erupts in deadly tracers as Japanese fighters swarm the massive bomber from every angle. But something impossible happens. The American gunners aren't even touching their weapons. Yet bullets are flying with deadly precision from turrets that seem to move by themselves, as if controlled by invisible hands. The Japanese pilots have never seen anything like it. They're about to discover America's most classified secret, a weapon so advanced, so revolutionary, that it would change aerial warfare forever. Main script begins. The year was 1944, and the Pacific War had reached a critical turning point. American forces were pushing closer to the Japanese mainland, but one massive obstacle stood in their way. How do you bomb a heavily defended island nation thousands of miles from your nearest base? The answer came in the form of the most advanced aircraft ever built, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. But this wasn't just any bomber. Hidden within its aluminum skin was a technological marvel that would leave Japanese fighter pilots stunned, confused, and ultimately defeated. Picture this: you're a seasoned Japanese Zero pilot, one of the elite defenders of the homeland. You've shot down dozens of American aircraft. You know every trick, every weakness of Allied bombers. But on this fateful night, as you close in for what should be an easy kill, something unprecedented happens. The massive B-29 doesn't behave like any bomber you've ever encountered. The gunners seem to see you coming from impossible angles. Their weapons track you with uncanny precision, even when you attack from blind spots. Most terrifying of all, the turrets move and fire even when you can clearly see that no human hand is controlling them. It's as if the bomber itself has come alive, defending itself with mechanical intelligence that borders on the supernatural. What these Japanese pilots didn't know was that they were facing the world's first operational remote-controlled gun turret system, a secret so closely guarded that even most American aircrew didn't fully understand how it worked. The B-29's Central Fire Control System represented a quantum leap in military technology, born from the brilliant minds of American engineers who had turned science fiction into devastating reality. But this story isn't just about machines and technology. It's about the young men who flew these missions, American boys, barely out of high school, suddenly thrust into aerial battles at 30,000 feet above enemy territory. Men like Sergeant Tommy Mitchell from Kansas, who found himself controlling 4 machine guns simultaneously while sitting nowhere near them, watching through a periscope as Japanese fighters dove through clouds of flak, their wings sparkling with cannon fire. The development of this revolutionary system had taken years of secret research, millions of dollars, and the combined genius of America's top scientists and engineers. From the drawing boards of Boeing to the testing grounds of Kansas, from the factories of General Electric to the skies above the Mariana Islands, this is the untold story of how American ingenuity created a weapon that Japan never saw coming. The Japanese military had prepared for everything, or so they thought. They had trained their pilots to exploit the blind spots of American bombers. They had studied every Allied aircraft, mapped every weakness, planned every countermeasure. But they had never encountered anything like the B-29's remote turret system. It was about to render their carefully crafted defensive strategies completely obsolete. But before we reveal how this revolutionary technology changed the course of the Pacific War, we need to go back to where it all began, in the mind of a brilliant engineer who dared to imagine the impossible. The year was 1940, and America wasn't even at war yet. But deep within the engineering offices of General Electric in Schenectady, New York, a brilliant 34-year-old electrical engineer named Paul Kollsman was about to change the future of aerial combat forever. Kollsman wasn't thinking about glory or heroics. He was solving a problem that had plagued military aviation since the first machine gun was mounted on an airplane. Picture the cramped, freezing gun positions of a World War II bomber. Gunners hunched over their weapons in tiny turrets, desperately trying to track fast-moving enemy fighters while wearing bulky flight suits and oxygen masks. The cold was so intense at 25,000 feet that machine gun oil would freeze solid. Men's hands would go numb inside their heated gloves. And worst of all, they could only see and shoot in one direction at a time, leaving massive blind spots that enemy pilots could exploit with deadly efficiency. Kollsman had seen the carnage firsthand through military reports. American bombers were being shot down at an alarming rate over Europe. The Luftwaffe had learned to attack from below and behind, where most bombers couldn't effectively return fire. Something had to change, or the daylight bombing campaigns would become suicide missions. But Kollsman wasn't just any engineer. He was a man obsessed with precision and control. His company had already revolutionized aviation with advanced altimeters and flight instruments. Now, he was about to apply that same innovative thinking to aerial gunnery. What if, he wondered, gunners didn't have to be physically present at their weapons? What if they could control multiple turrets from a single, protected position inside the aircraft? The concept was revolutionary, and many called it impossible. How could you aim a machine gun accurately when you weren't even looking through its sights? How could you track multiple targets simultaneously? The technology simply didn't exist. Or did it? Kollsman's breakthrough came through a combination of mechanical genius and electrical innovation. He envisioned a system where gunners would sit at centralized fire control stations, using periscopic sights connected to the turrets through a complex network of servomotors and gyroscopes. When the gunner moved his sight to track a target, electrical signals would instantly command the remote turret to mirror those movements with perfect precision. But the real magic lay in the computational element. Kollsman's system would automatically calculate lead angles, compensating for the relative motion of both the bomber and the attacking fighter. It would adjust for altitude, temperature, and even the ballistic properties of different ammunition types. In essence, it would turn average gunners into precision marksmen. The idea was so advanced that when Kollsman first presented it to military officials in 1940, many dismissed it as science fiction. Remote-controlled gun turrets? Automatic fire control computers? It sounded like something from a Buck Rogers serial, not a practical military weapon. But Kollsman was persistent, and a few visionary officers recognized the potential. By early 1941, with war clouds gathering over Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army Air Forces quietly awarded General Electric a development contract. The project was classified at the highest levels. Even within GE, only a handful of engineers knew what they were really building. They called it the Central Fire Control System, but those in the know had a different name for it, the Gunner's Guardian Angel. The development process would push 1940s technology to its absolute limits, creating servomotors fast enough to track enemy fighters, building gyroscopes stable enough for accurate fire control, and miniaturizing complex analog computers to fit inside an aircraft. Every component required groundbreaking innovation. But as brilliant as Kollsman's vision was, turning it into reality would require overcoming obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The real test was about to begin. The challenges were staggering. Imagine trying to build a computer in 1941, not the room-sized monsters that universities were just beginning to experiment with, but a compact, reliable machine that could perform split-second calculations while being shaken apart by aircraft engines, frozen by sub-zero temperatures, and subjected to the violent G-forces of aerial combat. In a secret laboratory in Schenectady, Paul Kollsman's team worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. The pressure was immense. Every month of delay meant more American bombers shot down over Europe, more young men who would never come home. The engineers knew that thousands of lives hung in the balance of their work. The first breakthrough came with the servo motors. These weren't ordinary electric motors. They had to be incredibly precise, responding to the slightest input from the gunner's sight while possessing enough power to swing heavy machine guns through rapid, violent movements. The tolerances were measured in fractions of degrees. A tiny error in tracking could mean the difference between a direct hit and a complete miss at 400 yards. But the servo motors were just the beginning. The real challenge lay in creating what they called the computing sight, a mechanical analog computer that could instantly solve the complex geometry of aerial gunnery. Picture this, AB-29 flying at 300 miles per hour, 25,000 feet above the Pacific. A Japanese Zero attacks from the side, diving at 400 miles per hour. The gunner has perhaps 3 seconds to acquire, track, and destroy the target before it's too late. In those 3 seconds, the computing site had to calculate the relative velocities of both aircraft, determine the correct lead angle, compensate for bullet drop over distance, adjust for air density at altitude, and account for the Earth's rotation. All of this had to happen automatically, without the gunner even thinking about it. He simply had to keep his crosshairs on the target, and the system would do the rest. The mechanical complexity was mind-boggling. Inside each computing site were hundreds of precision-machined gears, cams, and linkages, a clockmaker's nightmare built to aircraft standards. Every component had to be manufactured to tolerances that pushed 1940s machining capabilities to their limits. A single part out of specification could render the entire system useless. Then came the integration challenge. The central fire control system wasn't just one invention, it was dozens of cutting-edge technologies that all had to work together flawlessly. The gunner's periscopic sight had to be perfectly aligned with the remote turret. The servo motors had to respond instantly to command signals. The computing mechanisms had to remain accurate despite vibration, temperature changes, and electrical interference from the aircraft's other systems. Early tests were disasters. Servo motors burned out. Computing sites jammed. Electrical connections failed. In one memorable test flight, a prototype turret began spinning uncontrollably, nearly tearing itself apart before engineers could shut down the system. The test pilot later joked that he thought the plane was trying to screw itself into the ground. But Kollsman's team persisted. Each failure taught them something new. Gradually, incrementally, they began to solve the impossible puzzle. By late 1942, they had a system that actually worked, most of the time. The accuracy was revolutionary when everything functioned properly, but reliability remained a constant concern. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Boeing was designing the aircraft that would carry this miraculous technology, the B-29 Superfortress. But integrating Kollsman's fire control system into the bomber would present an entirely new set of challenges. The marriage of these two revolutionary technologies was about to create something that would fundamentally change aerial warfare forever. Seattle, Washington, 1942. Inside Boeing's massive Plant 2, something unprecedented was taking shape. The B-29 Superfortress wasn't just another bomber, it was the most complex aircraft ever attempted, a four-engine giant that would dwarf every other warplane in the sky. But hidden within its revolutionary design was a problem that would test both Boeing and General Electric to their limits. The aircraft itself was already pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled turrets, tricycle landing gear, and engines more powerful than anything ever mounted on a production aircraft. Boeing's engineers were essentially trying to build a flying fortress that could travel 3,000 miles, drop 5 tons of bombs, and fight its way through hordes of enemy interceptors, all while keeping its crew alive at altitudes where human blood would literally boil without protection. Now, into this already impossibly complex machine, they had to integrate Paul Kollsman's revolutionary fire control system. The challenge was staggering. The B-29 would carry 5 turrets, 2 on top, 2 on the bottom, and 1 in the tail, all controlled by just 3 gunners stationed in the pressurized forward and aft compartments. Picture the complexity. Miles of electrical cables snaking through the aircraft's frame, connecting gunner stations to remote turrets. Servo motors that had to function flawlessly at 40 below zero. Computing sites that could maintain their precision despite the violent vibrations of 4 massive engines. And all of this equipment had to be lightweight enough not to compromise the bomber's performance, yet rugged enough to survive combat conditions over the Pacific. The integration process was a nightmare. Boeing's chief engineer, Edward Wells, later described it as trying to wire a skyscraper while it's being built around you. Every system affected every other system. The fire control computers generated heat that had to be managed by the environmental systems. The servo motors drew power that stressed the electrical systems. The remote turrets changed the aircraft's weight distribution, affecting flight characteristics. Early test flights were exercises in controlled chaos. On one memorable flight in 1943, the entire fire control system went haywire during a routine test. Turrets began spinning independently, tracking imaginary targets while test gunner Sergeant Bill Harrison frantically tried to regain control. The pilot, Colonel Frank Cook, watched in horror as his bomber apparently began fighting a battle with invisible enemies. It was like the plane had gone insane, Cook later recalled. I could see tracer rounds flying in every direction from our own guns. For a moment, I thought we were under attack by our own aircraft. The incident forced a complete redesign of the control circuits. Boeing and General Electric engineers worked around the clock to solve what they called the ghost gunner problem, random electrical signals that could trigger the turrets to fire without human input. The solution required adding multiple redundant safety systems and completely redesigning the electrical architecture. But when everything worked properly, the results were breathtaking. Test gunners found they could track multiple targets simultaneously with unprecedented accuracy. The computing sites automatically adjusted for range, altitude, and relative motion, allowing average marksmen to achieve hits that would have been impossible with conventional gun turrets. By early 1944, the bugs had been worked out, mostly. The B-29s rolling off Boeing's production lines carried the most advanced defensive system ever mounted on an aircraft. But theory and practice are two very different things. Soon, these technological marvels would face their ultimate test, not against wooden targets on American test ranges, but against the elite pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy high above the burning cities of Japan. June 15, 1944. Chengdu, China. The air was thick with humidity and tension as the first B-29 superfortresses prepared for their maiden combat mission. These weren't test flights over Kansas wheat fields. This was Operation Matterhorn, the baptism by fire for America's most advanced bomber and its revolutionary defensive system. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Boston crouched in the upper forward gunner compartment of Jolton Josie, his hands trembling slightly as he performed his pre-flight checks. At just 19 years old, he was about to become one of the first men in history to control remote gun turrets in actual combat. The weight of responsibility was crushing, not just for his own life, but for the lives of his 10 crewmates who were depending on his ability to master this space-age technology. The target was the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yota, Japan, over 1,500 miles away across some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Japanese intelligence had been tracking the mysterious new American bombers, but they had no idea what they were really facing. Their pilots had trained extensively against captured American aircraft, studying every weakness, every blind spot of conventional bombers. They were confident, experienced, and deadly. They were also completely unprepared. As the formation of 68 B-29s droned across the East China Sea, Japanese radar operators picked up the incoming raid. Air raid sirens wailed across Kyushu as squadrons of Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters and Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony interceptors scrambled to meet the threat. Among them was Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's leading aces with over 80 confirmed kills. He had shot down countless American bombers and was supremely confident in his abilities. "These new American planes are big," he radioed to his wingman, "but big just means easier to hit." He was about to discover how wrong he was. The first wave of Japanese fighters approached the B-29 formation from the standard attack angles, below and behind, where conventional bombers were most vulnerable. But as they closed to firing range, something unprecedented happened. The American bombers seemed to see them coming from impossible angles. Gun turrets that appeared unmanned suddenly sprang to life, tracking the attacking fighters with uncanny precision. Sergeant O'Brien, sitting safely inside the pressurized compartment, watched through his periscopic sight as Japanese fighters materialized out of the clouds. The computing sight automatically calculated range, deflection, and lead angles as he smoothly tracked his targets. When he squeezed the trigger, 4.50 caliber machine guns in the upper forward turret responded instantly, sending streams of tracer fire toward the attacking Zero. The Japanese pilot, Flight Petty Officer Yamamoto, had never experienced anything like it. He was attacking from what should have been a blind spot, yet the American gunner was tracking him perfectly. Even more confusing, when Yamamoto looked through his gun sight, he could clearly see that no one was manning the turret that was shooting at him. It appeared to be firing by itself, guided by some invisible hand. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots had built their tactics around the known limitations of American bombers. Suddenly, those limitations no longer existed. The B-29s could defend themselves from every angle simultaneously, with a level of accuracy that seemed impossible. But the technology wasn't perfect, and combat would reveal weaknesses that no amount of testing could predict. As the aerial battle intensified over Japan, both American technology and Japanese tactics would be pushed to their absolute limits. The sky above Yota became a deadly ballet of aluminum and tracer fire. Flight Petty Officer Nishizawa rolled his Zero into a steep diving attack, targeting the lead B-29 San Antonio Rose. He had done this maneuver 100 times against American B-24s and B-17s. Get in close, rake the bomber with cannon fire, then break away before the gunners could respond effectively. It had never failed him. But as he closed to 300 yards, something impossible happened. The B-29's dorsal turret swiveled to track him with mechanical precision, even though he could clearly see the gunner's compartment was nowhere near that turret. The twin .50 caliber guns opened fire, sending a stream of tracers directly at his aircraft with deadly accuracy. Nishizawa threw his Zero into a violent evasive maneuver, feeling the thump of heavy machine gun rounds punching through his wing. This wasn't random defensive fire. This was precise, calculated shooting that seemed to anticipate his every move. For the first time in his combat career, the ace pilot felt a chill of genuine fear. Inside San Antonio Rose, Central Fire Control Gunner Technical Sergeant Robert Bobby Chen from San Francisco was experiencing his own moment of shock. The computing site was working exactly as designed, automatically leading the target and compensating for the B-29's motion. But the reality of combat was far different from training. Japanese fighters were everywhere, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously, and Chen found himself trying to engage 3 different targets at once. The Central Fire Control System allowed him to do exactly that. With quick movements of his periscopic sight, he could switch control between the upper forward turret, upper aft turret, and both lower turrets. In the space of 30 seconds, he engaged a diving Zero with the forward guns, tracked a Tony fighter with the aft turret, and fired at a third attacker approaching from below, all while never leaving his position in the pressurized compartment. The Japanese pilots were becoming increasingly desperate and confused. Their carefully planned attack formations were falling apart as they encountered defensive fire from angles that should have been impossible. Pilot after pilot radioed back to base with reports that made no sense to their commanders. "The American bombers are firing at us with ghost guns," screamed Lieutenant Takashi Kawamura over the radio. "The turrets move by themselves. There are no gunners in them." Some Japanese pilots began to suspect they were facing some kind of supernatural force. In the heat of battle, with adrenaline coursing through their veins and death lurking behind every cloud, the remote turrets seemed almost demonic in their relentless, precise tracking. But the B-29s weren't invulnerable. The remote fire control system, for all its sophistication, had one critical weakness: it depended entirely on electrical power. When Japanese cannon shells severed electrical cables or damaged the complex servo mechanisms, entire turrets could go dead, leaving gaping holes in the bomber's defensive coverage. Jolton Josie learned this lesson the hard way. A 20mm cannon shell from a diving Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick fighter exploded against the bomber's fuselage, severing the main power cable to the lower forward turret. Suddenly, Sergeant O'Brien found himself unable to defend against attacks from below and ahead, exactly where 3 Japanese fighters were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. The pilot, Major James Iron Mike Sullivan, threw the massive bomber into a steep climbing turn, desperately trying to present his remaining operational turrets to the attacking fighters. But with 65,000 pounds of aircraft to maneuver, the B-29 was like a whale trying to evade sharks. The 3 Japanese fighters pressed their attack with renewed confidence, sensing the wounded bomber's vulnerability. In that moment, high above the Japanese mainland, both American technology and human courage would face their ultimate test. The 3 Japanese fighters dove toward Jolton Josie, like hawks attacking a wounded eagle. With the lower forward turret dead, Major Sullivan's bomber had a gaping hole in its defensive coverage, and the enemy pilots knew it. They came in fast and low, their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns already chattering death. But they had underestimated the ingenuity of American aircrew under pressure. Sergeant O'Brien, his electrical systems damaged but his mind racing, did something that wasn't in any manual. He manually cranked the dead turret into position using the emergency hand controls, a backbreaking process that took precious seconds. Meanwhile, Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez from Texas swiveled his manually operated tail turret to assist, even though it meant leaving the bomber's rear approach undefended. The Japanese fighters opened fire at 400 yards, their shells sparkling along the B-29's wings and fuselage. But as they closed for the killing blow, both American gunners opened fire simultaneously. The crossfire was devastating. The lead Japanese fighter, a Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo, flew directly into the converging streams of .50 caliber fire and simply disintegrated, its pilot never knowing what hit him. The second attacker, seeing his leader's fate, broke off his attack run and climbed desperately away from the bomber. But the third pilot, a veteran named Flight Warrant Officer Kenji Matsumoto, pressed his attack with kamikaze-like determination. Matsumoto's Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony bore down on the B-29's nose, his cannons blazing. Inside the bomber, co-pilot Lieutenant Frank Morrison watched in horror as the Japanese fighter grew larger and larger in the windscreen. The pilot seemed to be aiming directly at the cockpit, and Morrison realized with crystal clarity that this was going to be a ramming attack. At the last possible second, Major Sullivan threw the bomber into a violent slip to the right. The Japanese fighter flashed past the cockpit so close that Morrison could see the pilot's face, a young man, probably no older than 20, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and absolute determination. The Ki-61's wing tip caught the B-29's No. 3 engine, tearing through the cowling and severing fuel lines. Immediately, the Wright R-3350 engine began trailing flame and black smoke. But Matsumoto's fighter, its wing sheared off by the impact, tumbled out of control toward the earth below. Jolton Josie was hurt but still flying. However, the battle was far from over. Across the formation, other B-29s were fighting for their lives against swarms of Japanese interceptors. The remote turret systems were performing beyond expectations, but the sheer number of attacking fighters was overwhelming. City of Los Angeles took a direct hit from a diving fighter, her No. 2 engine exploding in a ball of orange flame. The pilot, Captain William Hayes, fought to maintain control as his bomber began losing altitude. But even as his aircraft burned around him, his gunners continued to track and engage Japanese fighters with their remote turrets, shooting down 2 more attackers before the inevitable bailout order came. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was becoming severe. Many had never encountered defensive fire this accurate or this persistent. Some began breaking off their attacks prematurely, unwilling to face what seemed like supernatural marksmanship from unmanned turrets. But Japanese high command was already analyzing the battle reports, trying to understand this new American technology and develop countermeasures. The secret of the B-29's revolutionary defensive system was about to be exposed, and Japanese engineers were preparing their response. Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, June 17, 1944. The mood in the briefing room was somber as Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa listened to the combat reports from Yota. What he heard defied everything the Japanese military thought they knew about American bombers. "Respected Admiral," reported Commander Minoru Genda, his voice tight with concern, "our pilots describe weapons that fire without gunners, turrets that track our aircraft with impossible precision. The Americans appear to have developed some form of automatic defensive system." The reports were consistent and disturbing. Experienced pilots, men who had fought since Pearl Harbor, were describing encounters that seemed to border on science fiction. Turrets that moved independently. Gunners who could apparently see and shoot in multiple directions simultaneously. Defensive fire that anticipated evasive maneuvers with uncanny accuracy. But Admiral Ozawa was a pragmatic man. He didn't believe in magic or supernatural weapons. If the Americans had developed something revolutionary, it had to be based on technology, not sorcery. And technology could be understood, analyzed, and ultimately defeated. "Bring me our best engineers," he ordered. "I want every piece of wreckage from these new bombers examined. Every component analyzed. If the Americans have built a better mousetrap, we will learn how to break it." The breakthrough came sooner than expected. On June 20th, a badly damaged B-29 named Sweet Sue was forced to make an emergency landing on a small Japanese-controlled island near Kyushu. The crew was captured, but more importantly for Japanese intelligence, the aircraft's central fire control system was largely intact. Chief Engineer Captain Yoshio Yokoyama couldn't believe what he found inside the bomber. The complexity was staggering, servo motors connected to computing mechanisms that looked like precision clockwork. Electrical systems more sophisticated than anything in Japanese aircraft. And at the heart of it all, periscopic sights that could apparently control multiple gun turrets simultaneously. "This is not simply better engineering," Yokoyama reported to his superiors. "This represents a fundamental leap in military technology. The Americans have created a centralized fire control system that allows a single gunner to operate multiple defensive positions with automatic range and deflection calculation." The implications were terrifying. If the Americans could mass-produce this technology, Japanese air defenses would become obsolete overnight. Every tactic, every strategy developed over 3 years of war would have to be completely reconsidered. But knowledge of the enemy's capabilities also presented opportunities. Now that they understood how the system worked, Japanese engineers began developing countermeasures. If the remote turrets depended on electrical power, Then weapons specifically designed to disrupt electrical systems might be effective. If the gunners relied on periscopic sights, then attacks from multiple angles might overwhelm the operators. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training began to evolve. Flight instructors started teaching new tactics based on the captured B-29's capabilities. Instead of traditional attack formations, pilots learned to approach in coordinated swarms from multiple directions simultaneously, hoping to overload the American fire control systems. The psychological warfare aspect was also addressed. Japanese pilots were told that the ghost turrets were simply machines, sophisticated machines, but machines nonetheless. They could be damaged, confused, or overwhelmed. The key was to understand their limitations and exploit them. Flight Petty Officer Nishizawa, now recovered from his wounds, became one of the first pilots to train specifically against the new American system. Using captured intelligence reports, Japanese engineers built mock-ups of B-29 defensive positions. Pilots practiced coordinated attacks designed to exploit the few remaining blind spots in the remote turret coverage. "The Americans are clever," Nishizawa told his squadron mates, "but they are not invincible. Their machines are impressive, but machines break. Our spirits are eternal." The first test of these new Japanese tactics would come sooner than anyone expected. American intelligence had detected increased activity at Japanese aircraft factories, and another massive B-29 raid was already being planned. This time, both sides would be prepared for what was coming. July 7, 1944. Sasebo Naval Arsenal, Japan. The second major B-29 raid was about to test both American technology and Japanese adaptability in the most brutal way possible. This time, 107 superfortresses approached the target, their crews confident in their revolutionary defensive systems. But waiting for them were 200 Japanese fighters, trained in new tactics specifically designed to defeat remote turret technology. The Japanese strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Swarm attacks from multiple angles simultaneously, designed to overwhelm the B-29 gunners and their computing systems. Instead of sequential attacks that allowed the remote turrets to engage one fighter at a time, the Japanese would coordinate massive simultaneous assaults that would force American gunners to choose their targets and leave others unengaged. Flight Petty Officer Nishizawa led the first wave, his Zero accompanied by 11 other fighters approaching the bomber formation from the northwest. At the same moment, another squadron attacked from the southwest, while a third group dove from high altitude. The timing was critical. All three groups had to arrive at firing range within seconds of each other. Inside Memphis Belle II, Central Fire Control Gunner Sergeant Danny O'Sullivan from Chicago found himself facing exactly what Japanese tacticians had planned. His periscopic sight could only track one target at a time, but there were fighters attacking from 3 different directions. The computing system was working perfectly, automatically calculating firing solutions for whichever target he selected, but he could only engage one fighter while 2 others closed for killing shots. The psychological pressure was enormous. O'Sullivan had to make split-second decisions about which threats to engage while knowing that every choice might mean death for his crew. He locked onto Nishizawa's Zero, the closest threat, and squeezed the trigger. The upper forward turret responded instantly, sending tracers toward the diving Japanese fighter. But while O'Sullivan was engaging Nishizawa, Lieutenant Keisuke Yamada's Ki-61 Tony was boring in from the port side, completely unengaged. Yamada had studied the captured B-29 intelligence reports and knew exactly where the remote turret system's limitations lay. He approached from an angle that maximized his firing time while minimizing the bomber's ability to bring multiple turrets to bear. The Japanese pilot's 20mm cannon shells walked across Memphis Belle II's wing, severing hydraulic lines and punching holes in the fuel tanks. But more critically, several shells found their mark in the bomber's electrical compartment, causing cascading failures throughout the central fire control system. Suddenly, O'Sullivan's periscopic sight went dark. The servo motors driving the remote turrets seized up. In the space of 3 seconds, the most advanced defensive system in the world had been reduced to useless metal. "I've lost fire control," O'Sullivan screamed into his intercom. "All turrets are dead." But American aircrew were nothing if not adaptable. Throughout the formation, B-29 crews were switching to manual control, cranking their turrets by hand and firing through iron sights just like their fathers had done in World War I. The technology was gone, but the fighting spirit remained. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the tail gunner on Memphis Belle II, found himself in a position that hadn't changed much since the days of fabric biplanes. His manually operated tail turret was still functional, and he could see Japanese fighters lining up for attack runs on his crippled bomber. The next few minutes became a brutal test of human endurance versus mechanical precision. Rodriguez cranked his turret manually, tracking targets by eye and leading them by instinct. His .50 caliber guns hammered away at the attacking fighters, their recoil shaking the entire tail section of the bomber. One by one, the Japanese fighters pressed their attacks. Some were driven off by Rodriguez's accurate fire. Others were hit and damaged, but continued their runs with a determination that had made Japanese pilots legendary. A few succeeded in landing hits on the bomber, each impact sending shudders through the massive aircraft. The battle was turning into exactly what Japanese planners had hoped for, a conventional gunnery duel where numbers and determination mattered more than advanced technology. But American innovation was far from exhausted, and the B-29 crews were about to demonstrate that human ingenuity could triumph over any countermeasure. What happened next would be studied in military academies for decades to come. When their sophisticated fire control systems failed, American aircrew didn't panic, they innovated. Across the bomber formation, gunners began developing field modifications and tactical adaptations in real time, even as Japanese fighters continued their relentless attacks. Sergeant First Class Tommy Mac Reynolds, lead gunner on Yankee Doodle, discovered something remarkable. Even with his main fire control system damaged, he could still manually override individual turret controls. By rapidly switching between manual control stations, he could operate two turrets almost simultaneously, not with the precision of the computing system, but effectively enough to keep Japanese fighters at bay. "It's like playing two pianos at once," Mac shouted to his crew over the intercom, sweat streaming down his face as he frantically switched between control positions. "But I'll be damned if I'm going to let these guys have an easy target." The tactic spread throughout the formation as aircrews shared information over their radios. Soon, B-29 gunners were developing a new form of aerial combat, part technology, part manual skill, and entirely American ingenuity. They couldn't match the precision of their electronic systems, but they could still defend their bombers with a combination of determination and raw firepower. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots were discovering that their new tactics, while effective against the remote turrets, came with their own costs. The coordinated swarm attacks required precise timing and communication, but radio discipline began breaking down in the chaos of combat. Pilots found themselves colliding with their own wingmen or accidentally flying into the gun sights of other Japanese fighters. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced aces, watched in horror as two of his squadron mates collided while attempting a coordinated attack on Spirit of St. Louis. The tactic that looked perfect on paper became a nightmare in the three-dimensional chaos of aerial combat. "Break off! Break off!" Sakai screamed into his radio. "We're killing each other faster than the Americans are." But some Japanese pilots were adapting as well. Commander Yasuhiko Kuro developed what he called the Serpent Attack, a single fighter weaving through the bomber formation at high speed, presenting a target too difficult for manual gunners to track while firing short bursts at multiple bombers. It was dangerous and required exceptional flying skills, but for pilots of Kuro's caliber, it was devastatingly effective. Kuro's Kawasaki Ki-100 flashed through the B-29 formation like a deadly arrow. In the space of 30 seconds, he damaged 3 bombers and shot down Texas Tornado, sending the massive aircraft spinning toward the ocean with 2 engines on fire and half its crew dead or wounded. The air battle was evolving minute by minute, with both sides adapting their tactics to counter their opponents' latest innovations. American gunners learned to coordinate their manual firing, creating crossfires that Japanese fighters couldn't penetrate. Japanese pilots developed new approach patterns that exploited the slower tracking of manual turrets. But the most significant development was yet to come. In Lucky Lady, Chief Engineer Staff Sergeant Robert Kim from San Francisco was frantically working to restore power to his bomber's fire control system. Kim had studied electronics at UCLA before the war, and he understood the central fire control system better than most. Using spare parts cannibalized from damaged equipment, Kim began rebuilding critical circuits while the battle raged around him. It was like performing brain surgery during an earthquake, but somehow, incredibly, he began to restore functionality to individual turret systems. "I've got upper forward back online," he announced over the intercom. "Switching control to O'Sullivan." Suddenly, Sergeant Danny O'Sullivan found his periscopic sight flickering back to life. The computing mechanisms whirred as they recalibrated, and for the first time in 20 minutes, he could track targets with electronic precision again. The technological battle was about to take another dramatic turn. The moment Sergeant O'Sullivan's fire control system came back online, the tactical balance shifted dramatically. Japanese fighters that had grown confident attacking manually controlled turrets suddenly found themselves facing the precision of electronic fire control again. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Lieutenant Hiroshi Okamoto was lining up for what should have been an easy attack on Lucky Lady, when the bomber's upper turret suddenly swiveled toward him with mechanical precision. After 20 minutes of facing manually aimed defensive fire, the return of the remote turrets caught him completely off guard. The stream of .50 caliber tracers that followed was so accurate it seemed to reach out and grab his Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo fighter. Okamoto's aircraft shuddered as multiple rounds punched through his engine cowling and cockpit. Smoke began pouring from his engine as he fought to maintain control, but the damage was too severe. With his fighter dying around him, the young pilot had no choice but to bail out over the ocean, becoming another casualty of American technological superiority. Word of the restored fire control systems spread through the B-29 formation via radio. Other crews began attempting their own emergency repairs, using techniques shared by Sergeant Kim. It wasn't always successful. Electronics damaged by 20mm cannon shells don't repair easily, but even partial restoration of the central fire control system gave the bombers a significant advantage. The Japanese, meanwhile, were running into the limitations of their swarm tactics. Coordinating attacks by 200-plus fighters required precise timing and communication, but radio frequencies were becoming clogged with status reports, emergency calls, and tactical adjustments. What had started as a carefully orchestrated assault was degenerating into a chaotic free-for-all. Commander Minoru Genda, monitoring the battle from his headquarters, could hear the confusion in his pilot's radio transmissions. The elegant tactical plan was falling apart under the stress of actual combat conditions. "This is Red Leader, I have no visual on Blue Squadron. Blue Leader to all aircraft, abort Serpent formation, too much confusion. Mayday, Mayday, 077 going down, engine fire." The radio chatter painted a picture of increasing Japanese disorganization, while the American bombers maintained their steady course toward the target. The B-29's superior radio equipment and disciplined communication procedures gave them a significant advantage in coordinating their defense. But the most dramatic moment of the battle was yet to come. Flight Petty Officer Nishizawa, the ace who had survived the first encounter with B-29 remote turrets, was determined to prove that Japanese fighting spirit could overcome American technology. He had developed his own personal tactic, a high-speed head-on attack that would minimize his exposure to defensive fire while maximizing his chances of inflicting critical damage. Nishizawa climbed his 0 to 28,000 feet and dove toward the lead B-29 Enola Gay in a nearly vertical attack. His closing speed was over 500 miles per hour, faster than most B-29 gunners had ever encountered. The remote turrets tried to track him, but even their sophisticated computing mechanisms struggled with such an extreme attack angle and closing rate. Major Paul Tibbets, piloting Enola Gay, watched in fascination and horror as the Zero grew larger in his windscreen. The Japanese pilot was clearly planning a ramming attack, a kamikaze run that would destroy both aircraft. "Gunners, concentrate all fire on that Zero," Tibbets ordered over the intercom. "He's coming straight at us." Every operational turret on Enola Gay swiveled toward the diving fighter. The combined firepower was enormous, 10.50 caliber machine guns all converging on a single target. But Nishizawa's attack angle was so steep and his closing speed so high that the turrets could barely track him. The two aircraft rushed toward each other at a combined speed of over 800 miles per hour. In the final seconds before impact, both American gunners and the Japanese pilot were firing everything they had. The outcome of this deadly game of chicken would determine not just the fate of two aircraft, but the future of aerial combat itself.